Night in the Woods begins with a poem, clearly written by May, about the death of her grandfather. It's one of the more nebulous parts of the game, because the poem is never referenced again unless you visit Germ's house and meet with his grandma, where she puts her own spin on one of its final lines. The same is true of May's grandfather. You won't find out much about him through the main plot. You have to seek it out through side quests and conversations with minor characters, like Miss Rosa. Even his single appearance in the game at the church library is easy to miss. But that doesn't mean he's not an important character in the game's narrative. In fact, I think that May's grandfather is the key to understanding Night in the Woods on a deeper level. From the source of May's powers and dreams, to the political underpinnings of Possum Springs, to the rise of the cult, tracing the life of May's grandfather sheds light on so many of the game's greatest mysteries. And so, I invite you to join me for a one-of-a-kind video that will blend character analysis and theory as we take a close look at May's grandfather. Narratively speaking, the opening poem serves as an introduction to the world of Night in the Woods, to the town of Possum Springs. No matter what you choose for the first set of options, it's a reference to a calamity of some sort that struck Possum Springs, either man-made, like the highway extension, or an environmental one, like the flood. This helps set the tone for the game, making it clear that the town's decline was brought about by a convergence of political and natural factors. But it's the second set of options that is most interesting for our purposes. The options are as follows: in their wings, in their trees, all things die, be at peace, they feared death, so they ate the young, and they went looking for the gods and died in lonely places. No matter how you look at these three quotes, all of them are clear references to the cult of the black goat. In their wings, in their trees, all things die, be at peace, is commentary on their worldview. If Possum Springs is dying, as the cult fears, then it is the natural order of things, and thus they should accept its unfortunate fate. It's also a callback to the prayer of the forest god from Lost Constellation, a supplemental game that serves as a bit of a prequel to Night in the Woods. Lost Constellation is framed as a story May's grandpa is telling her, which makes its use here particularly appropriate. They feared death, so they ate the young is an obvious reference to the sacrifices the cult makes to the black goat. As evidenced by both Casey and the Harfest kid, they frequently target the young. And they do this, in their own words, to prevent the downfall of Possum Springs, or its death, as some might put it. They went looking for the gods and died in lonely places is a knock on the reality of the cult situation. They seek the gods, the black goat, but no matter how much they try to save Possum Springs, it isn't going to change things. It's slowly turning into a ghost town, a lonely place, and sooner or later, they will die there. You could also look at this as a bit of foreshadowing, as the cult went down to the mines to worship their god and ended up dying down there, with only May and her comrades aware of their fate. Based on this, I think we can say, with almost absolute certainty, that May's grandfather knew about the cult. The fact that they are taken from in-universe stories changes nothing. Clearly, May's grandfather chose them deliberately. Given that he said these things on his deathbed, it's likely that he was trying to convey his knowledge of the cult to those around him in the best way he knew how. But how did May's grandfather find out about the cult? If he knows about them, does that mean he was a member? And does the tooth that May finds in the crawlspace of her house have anything to do with this? The mystery deepens when you consider his last words. This house is haunted. What does that even mean? And how does it connect to his clear knowledge of the cult? We'll get back to the subject of her grandfather and the cult later, but let's start by digging into his last words. First off, his last words are definitely not an indication that May's literal house on Maple Street is haunted. Nothing that happens in the game indicates that supernatural events have taken place there, and while it could be a reference to the aforementioned tooth, there is a far better explanation for that incredibly interesting historical artifact. But the word house does not always mean a physical location. It could also be a reference to one's family, their house in a Game of Thrones sense, if you will. And in this case, I think that's exactly what May's grandfather is saying here, that House Borowski, May's family, is haunted. With May, this is clear to see. She's haunted by the Glimmer, her connection to the Black Goat, which is the root cause of everything from her dissociative personality disorder to her dreams, to the killer incident. But for May's grandfather to know about this, then surely he must have had the Glimmer himself, right? I think it's likely that he did. During May's dreams, when she seems to be astral projecting to other worlds, her character model is bathed in a blue tint. When May's grandfather visits her in the church library, he is, similarly, bathed in a blue tint. In addition, there is no known connection between her grandfather and the church library. He isn't summoned or anything along those lines. He just shows up. Then he spends some time with May and leaves of his own accord. Based on all of this, I think it's reasonable to assume that May's grandfather is astral projecting from the afterlife, and therefore making use of the powers he had in life to visit May from beyond the veil of death. This connection is deepened when you consider the many similarities between May and her grandfather. As revealed by Miss Rosa, he himself was quite a troublemaker. He vandalized his boss's car, slashed his tires, and broke his windshield. She also describes him as melancholic, but funny and wild, words that one could certainly say about May as well. But if May's grandfather had the Glimmer, then wouldn't the cult have wanted him to join them? Of course. I suspect that's how he knew about them in the first place. Based on the tone of the quoted lines in the opening poem, I think we can rule out the possibility that he was a member. Each of the lines is critical of the cult, dismissive of their ideology and worldview. But there's another piece of evidence that makes it quite clear that May's grandfather was opposed to the cult: the tooth in the crawl space. I've seen a lot of folks speculate about a connection between the Tooth Society and the cult of the Black Goat. Specifically, I've seen speculation that the Tooth Society is a precursor to the cult. As I always say, your interpretation is as good as mine, and don't let the fact that I'm a YouTuber change that. But I'm pretty certain that the Tooth Society and the cult are diametrically opposed to one another, operating on opposite ends of the political spectrum. If there is a connection between them, in my view, it's only because the fall of one led to the rise of the other. But I'll cover that in a future video. It's a big topic, one that delves deep into the history of Pennsylvania politics and the metaphor at play here. But back on topic, as we've discussed before, the cult is conservative, but the Tooth Society was a militant pro-union organization with leftist views. According to the newspaper article in the library, the teeth were used as tokens of membership to a group that defended workers' rights, and if a boss started abusing his employees, the members of the Tooth Society went out into the darkness and exacted sweet socialist vengeance. For all of you Disco Elysium fans out there, the Tooth Society was basically the Possum Springs version of the Hardy Boys. As mentioned in the article, the group dwindled after the strike of 1889, but still, descendants of the Tooth Society find the teeth from time to time. So although it's unlikely that May's grandfather himself broke some ankles and knocked some heads together in the name of workers' rights, as he wouldn't have been alive back then, the fact that the tooth is in the crawlspace of May's house, where he once lived with May and her parents, is a sign that he likely agreed with their philosophy. This is furthered by Miss Rosa's stories about him, as going to town on his boss's car is certainly something the Tooth Society would have approved of. In light of all this, the dismissive nature of the poems he quoted on his deathbed, and the presence of the miner's tooth, I think it's pretty clear that although May's grandfather clearly knew about the cult, he definitely wasn't a member, and probably opposed them. I think it's likely that the cult brought him down to the mines, much like they did with May at the end of the game, and tried to convince him to join them, only for him to reject them as thoroughly and wholeheartedly as May does. But if this is true, then why didn't he tell anyone about them? Well, probably for the same reason May doesn't. The universe of Night in the Woods is not a fantasy world. It's not The Witcher or Dragon Age, where a hungry god in the depths of a mine isn't a far-fetched idea. It's a world rooted in reality. If May's grandpa had spoken up about what he knew about the cult, no one, and I mean no one, would have believed him. And as the cult says to May during their conversation, even if he had said something, he wouldn't have been able to identify individual members. So instead of just coming out and saying something, he alluded to their existence on his deathbed. So to summarize our discoveries so far, May's grandfather had the Glimmer, knew about the cult, opposed them, and attempted to tell people about them before he died. But still, there are mysteries here that need to be unraveled. How far back does the Glimmer go in the Borowski family? And where did May's grandfather get the tooth in the first place? Once again, I believe the Possum Springs Library holds the answer. According to an article on the strike of 1889, it began after a memorial to miners who died in an explosion the previous year, a service that was held at the home of Arthur Borowski. We don't know how old Arthur was at the time of the strike, but if he was a working-age man, then it's likely that he's the grandfather of May's grandfather, her great-great-grandfather. The Tooth Society started up around 1870, meaning that Arthur was likely one of the group's founding members. This tells us a lot about Arthur. As a member of a pro-union militia, he probably went toe-to-toe with quite a few bosses in his day. Actions that aren't too far from the vengeance of May's grandfather, or May's own tendency to do crimes. Miss Rosa confirms this during one of her first conversations with May, where she says that one of May's ancestors, likely Arthur, was among the workers who fought back against the bosses in the wake of the Possum Massacre. And if Arthur had that in common with May and her grandfather, then it stands to reason that he had the Glimmer as well. If this is true, then it also shows us how the Glimmer has been passed down through the family line. If May's great-great-grandfather had it, and her grandfather had it, and she has it too, then it must skip a generation, explaining why May's father doesn't have it, and why he's a good bit different in his approach to life than May and her grandfather. Well, at least until May gives him the tooth in the epilogue, at which point May's father picks up right where May's grandfather left off, in his own small way. Even their adversaries are analogous, if you look close enough. The cult of the Black Goat might claim that they're out to protect the average working man, but in reality, they sure sound a lot like those bosses that Arthur used to strike against back in the day. Naturally, this comes together to put the words of Germ's grandmother into a crystal clear context. When she says to May, "Can you unhaunt a haunted house?" she's asking her if she can complete the decades-long struggle of her ancestors, her great-great-grandfather and her grandfather, the members of her lineage who shared her connection to the Glimmer and a tendency to do crimes against the Black Goat and the conservatives it uses to further its own agenda. For Arthur and May's grandfather, those conservatives were bad bosses who forced their workers into death march shifts on the job and abused them every chance they got. For May, it's a conservative murder cult willing to sacrifice young people in a desperate bid to keep their dying town alive. May's struggle is their struggle, just in a different time, with different players, on a different stage. But at its heart, it's the same battle. Fortunately for May, I believe she does indeed unhaunt the haunted house. The cult is dead. The Black Goat is buried beneath bodies and stone, and in her final confrontation with the Eldritch being, she comes to terms with her dissociative personality disorder, and wins her battle with mental illness for the time being. That won't save her forever, but it saved her on that day, as she puts it in the epilogue. Sure sounds like some demons have been exorcised to me. And that is why May's grandfather is so important to this story. He is someone she misses dearly, someone she aspires to be like. But he's so much more than that. He gives a quiet but epic weight to May's confrontation with the cult, transforming it from a personal battle to something of grander importance, a generational battle against the conservative murder cult in whatever form it takes, bringing harm to the people of Possum Springs. At the beginning of May's journal, the phrase, "Rest in peace, Granddad," serves as a reminder of just how much she misses him. After her success against the Black Goat and its cronies, I think we can say for sure that May's grandfather is not only resting peacefully, but proudly, knowing that May carried on his legacy, and that the cult he once rejected is now defeated, all thanks to her efforts. Thanks for watching. My next few character analysis videos will focus on May's family, and given the rampant speculation about her grandfather, I figured this was the best place to start. Next up, I'll be taking a look at her dad, Stan, before moving on to her mother, Candy. After that, we'll dive into the many side characters you folks have requested, like Lori M and Selmers. Can't wait to get into those. Huge shout out to my Night in the Woods collaborators Jordi, Jaen, Moreno, and Wolf.Godwin for my channel art and music for my videos. If you enjoy this type of content, then please consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. By joining either service, you can get access to everything from monthly newsletters to early access to my videos and access to my scripts as soon as I finish them. See you guys next time.